Welcome back. We are back once again with our monthly Grail update. If you have a bunch of Grails lying around and you are thinking about building somebody and you have no idea who you really want to invest into, this is the video for you until next month where we update it again and again and again and again, depending on how long we decide to keep this up. Either way, I would say this month didn't have a lot of new additions per se, but the new additions that really made a splash, mainly the Arcane, definitely shaked up things a bit more, which I definitely want to cover in this month's update of the Grail tier list. And for those tuning in for the first time, the Grail tier list more or less is a accumulation of 3 tier lists. One for Aether Raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena. And at the end of the video, I generally recommend units that I personally believe are worth investing into at this time. The list will change every so often depending when we get new skills or inheritables or whatever. But if you're looking to only invest into units for a certain game mode, whether that's Aether Raids, Arena, Summoner Duels, then you can just take any list at their own accord. But if there isn't anything that I didn't cover in this section or anywhere else, feel free to leave any question or just any feedback in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But yeah, that's what we're going to be doing once again, and we might as well just get right into it, starting with the Aether Raids tier list. I changed up the way I'm presenting this instead of like scrolling PNG that looks a bit blurry because it's all stretched out. Hopefully this looks a lot better and a lot sleeker, so if you're looking for a specific unit, it's going to be a lot easier to do this. This isn't the only graphic, by the way. I'm going to be going through the whole list and a multitude of graphics, so hopefully this is a lot better on the eyes and just general presentation and whatnot. Anyway, let's go into the first few promotions, that being in Cormag, Cornelia, and Winter Felix and Ignatz. Cormag I especially want to talk about real quick because I think he definitely went from one of the most generic Lance flyers we had in the game to arguably one of the better ones that we have currently. Especially on the free-to-play standard, I think his weaponry fund with a lot of the inheritables that we have right now makes him really, really competitive in not only something like Aether Raids, but also in Summoner Duels. And I'll get into that later when we get to that section. But for now, all you really need to know about Cormag's weapon is that it's a guaranteed follow-up slaying lance that grants Spectrum 8 and true damage reduction, aka the stuff that you see on stuff like Brave Dimitri, Spring Maria, and all those. And what this more or less turns him into is a secondary option for investments, because prior to Cormag, we had Har. The initial reason for Har making it all the way up to Superb had to do with Guard Bearing 4 just having flat damage reduction, because when it paired with true damage reduction, you essentially become a free-to-play Brave Dimitri, which while locking 5% is still going to be doing a significant amount. The reason why Dimitri in particular is generally scary as he is because he's paired up with damage reduction in his B slot, and generally when you remove that, he isn't nearly as strong, but he's still a really obnoxious tank regardless because of true damage reduction. As such, you apply it to somebody like Cormag and Har, and they have all the flyer skills, and they're basically going to be doing the same thing. And because of that, I found that there's no reason to just separate them from Har whatsoever. One final thing I would like to mention with Cormag before we move on is that he does get Spectrum 8 in his weapon, and while I probably already mentioned that, it means that with his stat line in particular, he could always go into an Omni Tank role, which may or may not necessarily be his best set. It's something you could always go into because he gets a lot of survivability from his weapon and B slot. He gets a guaranteed follow, meaning that even in scenarios where he isn't able to make a speed check, he can still double as long as the foe doesn't have full no follow-up. And then with whatever other skills you give him, preferably IO shield so he doesn't get completely popped, he could always end up being a really solid DC tank, especially with his color being blue. A lot of the threats right now are more predominantly red, so it is a really nice option to consider. And then we have Cornelia. Initially, I had her in the solid tier because I didn't really want to overhype her just based on something that was like, whoa, she has a cool PRF and she's free. You know, because it's one of those new toy syndromes I try to avoid as much as I can. So I put her in the solid tier. However, after a lot more consideration, I felt that her ability to be ran on an anima defense is really, really good, since it does make savior strats a lot harder to pull off. And the reason she's able to get away with this in particular is because she has the res to back it up. So Element can't prevent her weapon from going off, and unless the foe just plays around their spatial conditions, which they may be able to do in certain scenarios, it's going to be a lot more annoying and problematic for a lot of armors to just physically counter back. And if they can't do that, and if they just have to keep eating hits, it's going to be a lot harder for them to survive in general. And just for reference, I have a maxed out summoner supported Elamine right next to a maxed out Cornelia. Cornelia can't get summoner support, but she can get blessings. So even in scenarios where we're going up against the most Giga Chad whale where they have this obscene element that will just obliterate pretty much 95% of the cast, you have Cornelia, who just doesn't care. And I think this is especially important to note that you don't necessarily need the plus 10 Cornelia, especially since plus 10 elements are not going to be very, very common. But with the right animal mythics in tow, you should be able to get away with it at relatively low marge, and you may not even necessarily need stuff like Still Water 4 if it is a cost issue. And because of that, I find that her niche, not only on Anima, but even something like Dark, is just really, really valuable overall. And lastly, we have Winter Felix and Winter Ignatz. They were already doing relatively well when it came to Armored Beacon and the Arcane having damage reduction and guaranteed follow-up and all that stuff. That was already really, really good. But I find that now with Savvy Fighter 4, they are really on par with a lot of other armors. Now, granted, they aren't the pinnacle of armors whatsoever, but I think Savvy Fighter 4 having Brave damage reduction is a really nice step in the right direction. So even in scenarios where they may not necessarily get outsped, but they're still getting hit twice, they're getting damage reduction no matter what. And Armored Beacon protects them from stuff like Deadeye, Lethality, or Special Spiral 4. And depending on where you take them, they may end up performing really, really well. And before we get to all of the solid promotions, mainly the swords, I quickly want to highlight Linus. Linus as a free-to-play option, I don't think is necessarily bad whatsoever. I think he's more so a counterpart to Hans, where I find Hans is just generally better when it comes to damage output, but I think when it comes to just pure stat checks and speed checks, Linus is going to be significantly better, mainly because Dead Fang Axe steals the foe's buffs. So in scenarios where the foe does have visible buffs present, he could just negate them and take them as his own, making speed checks and damage reduction checks way easier than probably Hans. But at the same time, I feel that each of them just excel in one thing over the other, and if you were to replace them with the Arcane, I'm pretty sure Linus ends up becoming the better of the two. Still, I found that they weren't so different that they had to be in different tiers. That's why I put Linus in solid. And now let's get to the fun part. Devour. Arcane Devour, aka Wanderblade, aka Rutger's PRF, is everything a Godsword wants in their weapon, meaning that they have unlimited options when it comes to their B slot, their Sacred Seal, everything. It has no follow-up, slaying, breath, damage reduction on the first hit, and stats. It has everything you want. And because of that, so many swords became really, really viable. Whether that's Holst, who didn't really have the best PRF, bam, Arcane Devour. You have Joshua, Mass Marth, even Navarre and Lloyd. And you're seeing Lloyd right here. It's like, what did he do? He didn't do anything. Arcane Devour did everything. It pretty much has everything a Godsword wants, and really the only barrier of entry is going to be your speed. Granted, it does help if you have an attack stat, but even if you don't necessarily have the best attack stat for just enemy phase tanking, whether that's with Godlike Reflexes, Vital Astra stuff with Finish and Times Pulse and all that stuff, you can still function as a Gale Force unit. And you can still run into the issue of near saves just walling you, but I find that with Arcane Devour having flat damage reduction, Frenzy and Fury 4 and all that stuff, especially on an infantry, you don't even have to worry about guard stuff at that point, which is really, really great. So even with some swordies not necessarily being as good as the other ones, I find that there's so many roles that you can do with Arcane Devour on an infantry that it doesn't really mean all too much at the end of the day. I will say though, with the flyers in particular, I think it is a really nice addition, since you can not only act as a Wings of Mercy beacon if you really need to, but you could also do stuff like Guard Bearing 4 if you want to act in the enemy phase. Melee flyers have been doing pretty well as of late, and I think with Arcane Devour in tow, they're going to be doing a-okay. And as for Rutger, unfortunately, I did have to move him down. I love the dude, but with Arcane Devour, it really just becomes a matter of stat checks at that point. Wanderer Blade does have 10 attack speed, whereas Arcane Devour does have 5, and that's why I boosted his stats right here to +5, so it's all blue and stuff. Lumera is currently our latest and greatest free-to-play Godsword, although greatest, asterisk, whatever. This is the stat comparison he really has to deal with. This is also without any sort of attack boon on either of them, where I'm pretty sure Lumera has a super boon. But as you can clearly see, the differences are fairly minuscule when it comes to the speed, but the attack stat is a bit different. And if you already have an invested Rutger, I don't think it's necessarily the worst, especially since Wanderblade does have damage reduction per hit. But overall, I find that the differences aren't so grand that Rutger has to be a tier above them at this point. So whether or not you want to grab a Lumera or any other sword and you want to give them Arcane Devour and make them a budget, or quote unquote, or whatever the term is, Rutger, you have that option too. And then before moving on to the other changes that I made to the Aether Raids tier list, I do want to quickly bring up Itsuki. Itsuki, while I don't think is nearly as good as a lot of the other swordies, mainly because he doesn't have the speed to use Devour as well as the others, I think it isn't so bad that you just can't use it. And as far as infantry rolls go, especially with Devour, there's plenty enough that you can do, so I think for what it's worth, he could be in the decent tier. Along with the likes of Nacella and New Year Yarn. Nacella for a time was pretty good. He had Flashing Blade, half no follow-up, he had a lot of damage in his weapon. Pretty nice stuff overall. Although I think one of the only things when it came to Nacella was just his role in something like Aether Raids or a lot of other modes. And in Aether Raids in particular, I think the greater thing really was Gale Force, because he had Flashing Blade, really high movement, and half no follow-up, so it was really easy to get doubles and charge it. But now that we have so many other Gale Force options available to us, I don't think he nearly stands out as much as he once did, but he's going to be hitting a lot harder than the other ones. For better or worse, because obviously if you overshoot, then it's not going to be that easy to charge Gale Force. And as for New Year Yarn, he also follows a similar suit. I would argue in terms of Gale Force, Yarn is probably better because of the after combat spiral, but he doesn't have any sort of acceleration that Nacella does, although you could always outsource it with the likes of Na or anybody that fulfills a similar niche. I still find that he just follows in the same suit. It's not nearly as compelling, and it's really the only thing that he can do. And as for the can work category, they're mainly just general changes for enemy phase purposes. I find that when it comes to somebody like Kalik, New Year Kaiser, and Flame Mordecai, their enemy phase prowess isn't nearly as strong as a lot of other units, especially since units are hitting way harder nowadays, whether that's with true damage or just having obscene amounts of attack present. Damage reduction is looking to be a lot more valuable, but even with stuff like Flame Mordecai, who debuffs a fair amount, he doesn't really have a lot of enemy phase prowess or access to skills. And even stuff like Kalik, who isn't necessarily the fastest, still has Arcane. I would still say he's on the same level as Flame Mordecai and New Year Kaiser for the most part. And that's more or less why I moved them down here. I don't think they're completely awful, but at the same time, I don't think they're nearly on the same level as a lot of the other units above them. And as for our new Groom unit, Robin, I don't really know what you're supposed to do with him. Right now, Intelligence Systems is power creeping speed to the absolute limit, and that means a lot of slower units aren't going to be able to catch up or do as much damage, especially if they're archetypes where they can't just pierce through damage reduction stuff, whether that's with Special Power 4 or Deadeye or anything of this sort. I think the issue really just boils down to his archetype. He doesn't have a lot of options overall, and his stat line doesn't really help it whatsoever. So the only thing you really can do at that point is just try and stack attack and speed as much as possible. And the good thing about that is that pretty much every skill nowadays boosts 2 stats at once, so it's not really a lost cause whatsoever. Try and speed stack him, maybe throw him on a defense. You have Sea Feud and Arcane with Glimmer. Maybe he'll do something, but I can't say for sure. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but I guarantee he's going to be doing more damage than anybody in the I don't know man tier, because yeah, I don't know. The only one I really moved down there was Ursula, and that was mainly due to general change and lack of purpose. She could probably be thrown on an Aether Raids defense setting, but with Peony being there, her weapon doesn't work whatsoever, and we don't have an Arcane Tome as of yet, so right now she's just pretty much suffering with the rest. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the Aether Raids tier list. Next, we're going to move on to the Summoner Duels tier list, and I made a fair amount of changes here, but it's more or less going to be the same stuff as you saw in the Aether Raids tier list. A lot of changes due to the Arcane. I already went on my tangent when it came to Cormag, and I think it follows suit here. He is going to be a really good tank and general support because of stuff like Guard Bearing 4 and Guidance 4. And what he's doing in Aether Raids more so kind of carries over here. He sits there, he tanks really well, and for Summoner Duels in particular, he could have allies fly in with Guidance 4, and he's just going to be that really obnoxious physical or even magical wall depending on how you want to run him. Because Guard Bearing 4 and true damage reduction go so well together. This is where I do want to quickly mention this because you see that a lot of units were pushed down, and I moved Cormag and Tahar all the way up to Superb. My stance when it comes to Summoner Duels, if you don't already know, is that it is one of the most strict game modes out of any game mode in FEH. There is stuff you could get away with in pretty much any other mode. In Aether Raids, you can speed stack to Oblivion, and it doesn't even matter at that point because Mythic Blessings and supports are everywhere. In Arena, it's all BST, so it really doesn't matter at that point. But with bonuses and legendaries and everything going on there, you can also do a fair amount of stuff there too. And even in PvE, you can manipulate stuff in a fashion that just benefits pretty much every single unit in the game. But for Summoner Duels, you can't do that. For Summoner Duels, what you see is what you get, and every player can do the same thing you can do. Whether they will, highly debatable. But it is a even playing field for everybody that isn't a whale, at least. And because of that, I want to be more strict when it comes to the superb tier, and only save it for what I would argue are some of the best Grail options when it comes to the mode. And really, the top echelons of that are going to be Cormag, Cynthia, and Har. Not only because of their access to Guard Bearing 4 and Guidance 4, Har and Cormag have true damage reduction, so they're going to be some of the best physical tanks in general. And Cynthia having access to Legendary Robin at any given point means that she could become a massive stat ball and become just as, if not more, obnoxious than Har and Cormag. And because of that, I find that they all should share the superb tier. The only one I didn't move down was Zephiel, and that was mainly due to his stat line with the Arcane Sword. I think that's fine enough to keep him there. Other promotions include Sword number 1 with Arcane Devour, Sword number 2 with Arcane Devour. Oh, there's only 2. Anyway, Arcane Devour has everything a God Sword wants. I went over it like crazy earlier, but the summarization, slaying, breath, stats, no follow-up, and damage reduction. What more can you need? They put them on the same level as somebody like Rutger with his PRF, and because of that, I moved up the units that were speedy enough, in my opinion, to go into the solid tier. And even for units like Winter Felix, Winter Ignat, Cervantes, and Vigard, and all of those, I think they still perform relatively well for what it's worth, but in something like Summoner Duels where everything is a much more even playing field, it's definitely going to be a lot harder to get away with stuff that they can normally do in something in an Aether Raid setting. And because of that, I do want to be a bit more strict with their placements, and I move them down to the solid tier. Next, we have the decent tier, and this is where I put Fallen Linus. I think his PRF is fine, but it's also not necessarily going to be the most consistent thing, and that really boils down to just two of the most absurd units that we have in that mode right now, being Legendary Robin and Legendary Eliwood. Legendary Eliwood buffs everyone's stats like crazy. They have bonus doubler, they have fixed cancel 1. There's a lot going on there, and I think it's great that he could still steal those buffs, but you're not stealing anything from a Legendary Robin because they're not visible buffs, they're visible debuffs. And some sickos like to run both Legendary Robin and Eliwood at the same time because they don't like to have fun. Point being, I find that while his PRF is still relatively good in the sense of stealing buffs, it's not going to be the most consistent, especially for an enemy face setting where he doesn't have any sort of slaying, special acceleration, anything. And at that point, I find that you're really just better off replacing his weapon for Arcane Downfall, just so he could get stuff like godlike reflexes and all sorts of other stuff going way easier. But of course, you still have your other god swords that could still use stuff like Arcane Devour. You also have Bartram and a lot of the other slow, bulky cabs I moved up here. I moved them up here because of alarm attack speed. Obviously, the speed isn't going to be doing anything for them, but it's not really about the stats that you get from it, but it's more so about the cancel 1 that you get out of it. With Hidden Run, alarm attack speed, hopefully we get alarm attack defense in the future, but I think this is okay enough for now. And with the Arcane Sword that debuffs attack and defense and has guard built into it, you can pretty much just make them a physical wall, back up with Hidden Run, and with cancel 1, move ever so closer to your far state protection so they could still act as a physical wall and be protected at the same time. That is more so my logic with this skill than anything else. And I did promote Fernand and Orson because of that as well. And there were other units that you could potentially use it on, but I felt that when it came to the overall stat lines of it all, these are probably some of the better ones available. You also have Summer Fiora and Thief Rickard that are also going to be doing a similar thing. They could run something like Guard Bearing 4 with Guidance 4, or even the new Speed Defense Rain Snap if you want other supports in tandem with the role. They're pretty much going to be doing the same thing, although their tanking prowess isn't nearly as good. I think Arcane Devour, though, is fine enough. It has flat damage reduction. Guard Bearing 4 has flat damage reduction. As long as you meet the speed check, it should be good. And then as for Geralt, I decided to move him down to decent. I think he could still do the whole alarm thing if you really want him to, but his whole shtick with Breaker Lance isn't exactly the most compelling right now. And that's, again, mainly due to Legendary Eliwood and Legendary Robin. Panic overall in something like Summoner Duels, I don't find to be as valuable, just because there's just so many ways to either negate it, or the foe takes advantage of it, especially with some something like the Legendary Robin, where you just get additional stats from the panic and debuffs that he inflicts on them. There can be scenarios where the panic and debuffs do help out a lot, but right now it doesn't really look as compelling, and because of that, I did want to move him down. And then lastly, we have Groom Robin and Spring Loki. Groom Robin really isn't that great of a unit, but with the Arcane and his really high attack set, you could always try and run him with a Blazing Wind set with something like dual Asker support or anything that just accelerates his special cooldown to the point where he can get an instant Blazing Wind. I think you'll be pretty good on that front, but I also don't know if it's going to be enough for somebody like him. Still, 80 visible attack, assuming it's just this image in particular, is really good for AoEs. And with Spring Loki, she was more so a general change. She has Guidance 4, which can still be nice for utility if you really need it. Seal Defense 4 with Catch and the Arcane or even Whitecap. She can still do an okay amount of damage, but her Saline does not help whatsoever. You can always swap it around depending on the team composition. If you want Whitecap, just keep Whitecap. Arcane is with something like a Catria or Cordelia Ball. I think you'll be pretty fine figuring which one you want more over the other. But overall, I don't think she's nearly as bad as the ones in the last tier, but I wouldn't say she's really the greatest. I will say Guidance 4 is nice though. And that's about it when it comes to the Summoner Duels tier list. Lastly, we have the Arena tier list, and it's fairly self-explanatory. You have good BSC, you're good. You don't have good BSC, you're bad. The end. The new additions being Fallen Linus, Cormac with his Refine, and Groom Robin. As for who you really want to look for when it comes to scoring, these are probably some of your better options overall. You have the generic armors and Cervantes and Vigard, although Vigard does hit 200 BST, which is pretty insane. I'm pretty sure he's one of the only units that can do that right now. Hans, Linus, really high scoring infantry, same with Lumera, Holst, Mordecai, etc, etc. You have plenty of options if you really want to. But if you don't want to use any of them, you still have Boyd, Effie, Garen, etc, etc. There's good options all around for scoring. Just keep in mind that you can't score as well with an Arcane, but if you already are a generic, it doesn't matter at that point. Still, with Cormac and Linus in tow, Cormac pretty much scores the same as pretty much every other early gen unit with a PRF at this point. You give them a dual skill and they're going to be scoring the same. Linus is brand new, so he scores really high, especially with a PRF. Meaning that if you did want to build him, you have the option, although Hans is also right there, so he's not exactly your only option. You'll just have to determine which one you value more, because at the end of the day, it is just a BST race. And as for Groom Robin, he doesn't score the worst because, well, he has access to duel, but I don't think you really want to be running units that score like Ninja Hana nowadays, because BST creep and the new arena change makes it so a lot of these units aren't necessarily as compelling for something like arena. But yeah, that's more or less the arena tier list. These are always the shortest sections because there's really nothing to talk about. It's all BSC at the end of the day. But there is the matter of the final tally and who I would recommend you build currently in the month of May. Well, I think 3 of them are fairly obvious in the form of Cormac, Har, and Cynthia. Cormac easily had one of the best glow-ups this month, and I could not be any more happy. I think he's a badass Lance Flyer, and he's easily accessible and mergeable, so anybody that really likes him or is looking for a nice free-to-play option, you have him right there. Although you also have Har and Cynthia, who are also really great on their own too. Fallen Dorothea, who was also just on a Hall of Forms. She's a nice option because she could act really offensively pretty well. Lumera, your new God Sword. Zephyr, your old God armor. Not really God, but he's an armor. And Felix, Ignatz, and Vigard, especially Vigard for scoring. You have a lot of options at your disposal. And that's really going to be it when it comes to the Grail tier list. If you have any questions or concerns when it comes to the video, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.